हो गया लाइव लाइव है हम लोग जावेद so
हाँ लाइव
it's already 12:05. Am I audible? Okay, so I think we should start the program now. So good afternoon everyone. Honorable Chancellor Professor Syed Wasim Akhtar, Honorable Pro Chancellor Dr. Syed Nazim Akhtar, Honorable Vice Chancellor Professor Javed Mosarrat, our guest speaker Dr. Irfanullah Farooqui, Head Humanities Professor Zeba Akhil, faculty members, dear students, and everyone present here. I, Dr. Arshna Pandey, Assistant Professor Sociology, feels it a matter of great privilege to extend a warm welcome to each one of you gathered here today. As you know, the topic of today's lecture is understanding the relationship between sociology and literature. The purpose of this lecture is not just to convey, but to delve into the profound interconnection between the two significant disciplines of humanities, that is, sociology and literature. Most of you must be thinking about the relevance of this topic. So, let me tell you the dialogue between sociology and literature has the potential to illuminate the path towards a more just, more humane, and more enlightened society. And to illuminate that path, we have today with us Dr. Irfanullah Farooqui as guest speaker. Before starting the lecture, let me introduce him briefly. Dr. Irfanullah Farooqui taught sociology at South Asia University, New Delhi for 5 years. Prior to joining SAU, he taught at Aligarh Muslim University around for 3 years. He also taught at Jamia Millia Islamia as a guest faculty. He did his MA, MPhil and PhD at Center for the Study of Social Systems JNU. For his MPhil dissertation, he worked on Faz Ahmad Faz and underlined the deeper connections between literary imagination and social reality. For his doctoral studies, he worked on Muhammad Iqbal's letters and tried to put forth a set of arguments that make a compelling case vis-a-vis reading Iqbal's poetry and politicals afresh. An avid supporter of interdisciplinarity, he is interested in the intersections of literature, history, and politics. Currently, he finds himself inclined towards questions pertaining to academic freedom, academic community, university, and nation building identity, secular religious dynamics, sociology of education, Islam and Muslims in South Asia, and Urdu studies. Currently, Dr. Farooqui is Senior Visiting Fellow, Center for the Study of Plural Societies, New Delhi. Now, with these words, I again welcome Dr. Farooqui and request him to kindly start the lecture. Thank you. So, please.
Thank you. Am I audible? Can you hear me? Okay,
yes
Audible,
excellent.
sir.
And I have about 40 minutes. Would that be all right if I speak for about 40, 45 minutes? Okay,
yes
great. Thank you, Dr. Pandey. I'm grateful to the organizers for this invitation. It is always um, exciting to of course, as I said, that the organizers have sort of done a great favor to me. Uh, in addition to that, I would also like to extend my gratitude to the head and the dean and everyone else who kind of conceptualized this particular event. I understand that of course, it's good to have familiar faces. I know Javed, Dr. Javed Akhtar, since he was pursuing his doctoral research at Jamia, and I understand that we also have Faizan in the department, and I know Faizan since his MA days in AMU. So good to know, good to have um, known faces, familiar faces in the audience. But having said that, I'm most grateful to each and every one present in the audience, and I sincerely hope that I make some sense in the next 40 to 45 minutes, and those present here find at least a few takeaways from this particular talk. So, without any delay, because I only have 40 to 45 minutes, let me just straight away dive in and share my thoughts on this topic. And the topic, as you know very well, is understanding the relationship between sociology on the one hand and literature on the other. So, this is what I'm going to speak about. Now, I decided to speak on this particular relationship because I have been interested in this intersection, the sociology literature intersection, for almost 2 decades now. So I think I started my master's in 2004 August, and we are in May 2024. So it's been close to 2 decades that I have been interested in sociology literature connections. In fact, I did my undergrad, I did my BA in literature. So I studied literature during my undergrad studies. I actually grew up with literature all around because my father was a literature professor, and um, he was well versed in 5 languages and literatures. So while growing up, I had quite a heavy dosage of, solid literature, poetry. So I had it in my blood, if I may say so. But nevertheless, in terms of formal education, I did literature in my undergrad. I studied Urdu English literature, and then I was essentially keen on doing masters in English literature. But as fate would have it, I didn't get through MA English. I had written the MA English JNU entrance examination in 2004, and I had written MA Sociology as a second choice, and I got through MA Sociology. I did not get through literature. So, in many ways, my entry into sociology, or my foray into sociology, was, one could say, accidental. It wasn't really planned. So, I started sociology not because I intended to, but because I just, got a chance to do sociology. So, I started as an MA sociology student, but my interest in literature remained as it is. It did not get affected. And as a result, as Dr. Pandey just read out in the introduction, and you might know this, that so both my MPhil and PhD in some ways were in this subdomain. Within sociology, there is a subdomain called sociology of literature. So my work, MPhil dissertation, and my PhD thesis, in some senses, can be associated with, or can be linked with, sociology of literature. And interestingly, while I was doing my MPhil and PhD, many of my professors did not really like it. Did not really like it because they considered uh, sociology of literature, or the kind of work that I was doing, they considered it kind of less sociological. So there was a lot of resistance. Many of my professors considered my work as totally useless. In fact, they kept asking me to do something on inequality, on caste, on Muslim identity, something more empirical, something maybe informed by some quantitative applied sociology. But of course, I held my ground, and I continued doing what I really wanted to do. But as I said, that many of my professors, and some of them are still there in JNU, they considered that whatever I was doing was a total waste, whether it was my MPhil or my PhD. Now, why is it that something that I was trying to do in terms of sociology literature connections? Why is it that we think of it as a waste or not good enough? And this is where we get into, and that's the beginning. So I'll just do a bit of landscaping, as is always the case. I just want to draw your attention to some sort of background, and then get on with the crux of the matter. So the question that we have for ourselves is, why is it that few subdomains are appreciated, and few subdomains are not? For example, sociology of religion. It has a massive following. If you think of sociology of inequality, if you think of sociology of caste, if you think of sociology of identity, you think of sociology of disability, sociology of gender. There's so much all around, and they have a massive following. But when we think of sociology of literature, or sociology literature connections, uh, it's not really a subdiscipline that has a massive following. Now, this is where we get into the idea of discipline, right? What exactly does the word discipline mean? What is discipline? Now, discipline here, of course, is not in terms of disciplining as in discipline and punish, but discipline in terms of how subject matters are looked at as discipline. So, when we think of sociology as a discipline, or when we think of literature as a discipline, what is it that we are thinking about? So basically, disciplines can be looked at as what I call, or what has been called, thought domains. right? Thought domains, meaning that when you are part of a discipline, you begin to think a specific way, right? So disciplines are to be considered as thought domains. So if you are a sociology person, then you are bound to think a certain way. If you are a literature person, you are bound to think a certain way. So these are thought domains. So when we think of disciplines, we are not just thinking about what these disciplines study. So, for example, let's say if we take if we take the case of sociology. So, sociology, let's say sociology is studying division of labor, right? Or sociology is studying suicide, or sociology is studying alienation. Now, we know very well, and some of you might have already done your thinkers, 19th century thinkers and early 20th century sociological theory. We know very well that disciplines don't only look at a particular subject matter. So it's not simply about sociology studying division of labor, but it is about how these disciplines look at the subject matter. So what is more important is how is it that sociology looks at division of labor that makes it different from the way economics looks at division of labor, right? So disciplines are not just about subject matter, but disciplines are also about the perspective. Disciplines are also about the vantage point. So basically, and this is again very clear, if you look at the 19th century, and I just want to take a minute here, if you look at the early thinkers, you look at Auguste Comte, you look at how Comte was very particular about sociology as a distinct discipline or sociology as a unique discipline. So Comte was very clear that whatever sociology was studying, there was no other science that was studying that. So, in that sense, uniqueness, distinctness of the discipline. And similarly, following Comte, you have Durkheim, who was, of course, a positivist par excellence. And Durkheim is someone who is associated with professionalizing sociology. So, Durkheim, if you look at his intellectual contributions, Durkheim is primarily interested in carving out a specific disciplinary domain for sociology. So, if you look at his works, for example, if you look at Division of Labor, what is it that Durkheim is trying to do? Durkheim is trying to put forth an understanding of division of labor that is different from the understanding that is put forth by Adam Smith. So basically, his argument is that in sociology, we have to understand division of labor differently. We cannot understand division of labor the way economics would have us understand. Similarly, in the case of suicide, he is very clear that we have to understand suicide not from the vantage point of psychology, which is to do with incidence of suicide, but from the vantage point of sociology, which is to do with the rate of suicide. And in relation to social fact as well, Durkheim is very clear that sociology is not philosophy, because philosophy is about sitting, thinking, pondering, armchair stuff. But sociology, the idea of social fact, is something that's to do with going out, observing, in the field, empirical, etc. So we get it very clearly that in the early days of the discipline, and this is not just for sociology, any discipline, if you look at the early formative phase of any discipline, the practitioners, the theorists, the philosophers, the writers of the discipline insist on the uniqueness, on the distinctness, on the individuality of the discipline. So disciplines are essentially carved out, or disciplines are essentially pitched a certain way. And it is important, it is very important for us to understand why disciplines have to be there. Disciplines are important. Why are they important? Because they help us do away with a certain convenient way of knowing. So, generally speaking, in our day-to-day life, there is a very convenient way in which we get to know. But what disciplines do is they help us do away with that convenience. They shape our thought. They help us in curating things a certain way. They bring in some rigor in our day-to-day ways of knowing. So disciplines are important. And to be engaged in a discipline is to shape ourselves and to be shaped by what the discipline teaches, what the discipline engages with. And it is only by engaging, or it is only by becoming a part of a discipline, after a point in time, we become part of a scholarly community. So, for example, if you've done your master's, MPhil, and PhD in sociology, you become part of in all likelihood. You become part of this scholarly community called the sociologists. And then you can engage with other people, you can engage with fellow students, you can teach, you can do research. And in some senses, then we will say, we have become disciplined, meaning that now we think about the world a specific way. However, now this was the background, but disciplines also limit our quest for truth. So, on the one hand, it is good to be disciplined, it is good to initiate ourselves into disciplines or any particular discipline. But if we go too far into it, then what happens is they also reduce us as, as explorers. They also limit our quest for truth. So the word in English that we use in this context, and there is a certain negative connotation to it, the word is disciplinarization. Disciplinarization, which is about some kind of a protectionism, intellectual protectionism, that we simply hold the line, we guard the fort, we do not let anything from outside come in. We become very particular about how we look at things, what we study. So this is what we call a certain kind of epistemic or a certain kind of disciplinary protectionism. And this leads to all kinds of problems. There's a famous French sociologist, some of you might have already read his works, Pierre Bourdieu. And Bourdieu has written on a fantastic concept called epistemic reflexivity. So basically, his argument is that when we get into various disciplines, we lose out on this idea of reflecting on ourselves. So this reflexivity is something that gets compromised, and this epistemic reflexivity is something that is very important. So if we get too much into the discipline, if we get too disciplined, then the epistemic reflexivity is something that might get compromised. Now, here we think about then, so what is the way out? And this is where people say that if we were to kind of engage with two disciplines, right? Let's say you are primarily from sociology, but you also engage with history, or you also engage with anthropology, or you also engage with economics, or you also engage with, in this case, literature, or you also engage with political science. So if you begin to engage with one more than one disciplines, then what happens is you are able to see some of the problems in your own ways of doing things. So for example, people from outside, and this is a classic example, I'll just give a very day-to-day example. So let's say if we have to figure out, so how should I put it? So basically, if we are thinking about Indian society, and because we are Indians, we know things inside out, and there is a certain for grantedness with which we live as Indians. But let's say you are visited by a friend from some other culture. Let's say you're visited by someone from France, or you have a friend from Germany or the US or Denmark, you name it. Now, this person is with you in India, in some part of India, let's say Lucknow or Aligarh or Delhi or wherever, and you guys are walking, right? You're walking down the road, you're on a stroll, and then as you walk, this person tells you about your own society, a few things that you never paid attention to. This happens all the time, right? Someone who comes to our family or comes to our house might tell us about a thing or two about our family and house that we never paid attention to. And why is that? Because it's a simple case of what we call the insider and the outsider. Because we have been in the family, we have been in the house, we have been in our society far too long. And as a result of that, we have not really critically uh, reflexively engaged with these domains, whether it is the house or the family or the society in which we live. But someone who comes from outside actually looks at things very differently. And then this person helps us look at our things differently, and we are able to understand our own stuff better as a result of the outsider's intervention. So, exactly the same way, if you are working with two disciplines, then what happens is the other discipline very often helps us understand some of the limitations in our own discipline's rigor. So, in that sense, it is pointed out that when you work with two or more disciplines, then what happens is you become more reflexive, you become more open minded, you become more flexible in your approach, and that is very good, particularly in the 21st century, which is considered as an age of interdisciplinarity. We have no other option but to bring disciplines together and not really continue with orthodox, conservative disciplinarians. Now, if we talk about sociology and literature, right, if you're looking at the relationship between sociology and literature, so basically the first thing that we have to understand is that there is a certain sort of um, that they both share a lot. Sociology and literature share a lot. So they are not really that off each other. The distance is not really unbridgeable. They share a lot in the sense that if you look at the subject matter of sociology, basically sociology is interested in the social, right? So whether we are talking about processes or institutions or relationships or behavior or structures or change, these are things that sociology is interested in. And sociology is endlessly interested in the man's social world. And similarly, literature is also very much occupied with man's social world. And literature also tries to make sense of how do we as human beings adapt to our worlds, how do we try and change our worlds, and what happens as we try to do that. And literature also goes beyond description. It does not simply describe the society, it kind of goes beyond what we call merely description. So, in some senses, literature and sociology, as two different disciplines, are pretty much interested in something that can be considered as the overlapping thing is man's social world. Now, and there are scholars who've pointed out that unless and until sociologists really inform themselves of the literary analysis of society, they will never be able to comprehend the society fully. In fact, none other but M.N. Srinivas, towards his later years, in fact, in his last years as a great anthropologist, sociologist, ethnographer, Srinivas was very clear that we need to, as sociologists of India, particularly, he was talking about India, he was very clear that unless and until we borrow from literature, our analysis of Indian society will not really be full. It won't really be an accomplished, a flawless, or let's not say flawless, but a great analysis. So we have had that sentiment among sociologists who believe that it is very important for students of sociology, practitioners of sociology, scholars of sociology to borrow from literature or to benefit from literature. Now, what happens is now the only concern. So when we look at sociology and literature, so I just flagged before you the overlaps that that they're both interested in what we call man's social world. However, it doesn't really end there. The point is that when we say sociology and literature, and I'm a sociologist, so basically what I'm looking at is how I, as a sociologist, engage with literature. So in sociology, literature is basically looked at as a social product, meaning that literature is not something that is studied in isolation. It's a social product, meaning that it is produced in a certain social, cultural, historical context, right? So that is predominantly what we do in sociology when we engage with literature. So, in some senses, one could say social analysis of literature. And within sociology, particularly Marxism, right? Marxism is very clear about this. Of course, Marxism, in some senses, dismisses literature as part of the superstructure, at least the dominant strand in Marxism. But they look at literature as a social product. So that's a very, very prominent position. Now, so what is it that we are trying to do when we engage with with literature? We are looking at the writer. So let's say any writer, the social situation of the writer, let's say the class background, in what particular period did this writer write, what were the specific social, economic, political conditions that influenced his work or her work, etc., etc. Now, these are things that we do. Now, of course, people in literature are not very happy about it because we have to look at it from both sides. Right now, I'm talking about all of this as a sociology person. So, As a sociologist, I'm saying literature is this, literature is that, author is this, author is that, conditions are this, conditions are that. But if you turn the tables and you think about it from the vantage point of those who are in literature, they are not very happy about this, because for them literature is something that is to be looked at from within. So they pay attention to, say, for example, things like metaphors, idioms, imagery, similes, sentence structure, the fact that text is essentially self enclosed, that it is an inside enterprise, and we should not really bring in anything from the outside. So I must put on record that while I am speaking about sociology and literature connections, many literature scholars or literary scholars are not happy about this. They do not want literature to be subjected to a sociological study. They're not happy about it because they believe that literature must be studied through literary tools and not really sociological tools. So this is also something that I wanted to point out. But in general, because they sort of share their interests, in some senses we can say that they complement each other, right? They complement each other. It is also pointed out that literature is an extraordinary document, in the sense that literature documents an entire age. So it is through literature that we get to know about the period that we want to understand. uh, there are people who have also said that literature provides a mirror to the age. But of course, this is also a slightly it's a slightly tricky argument, because this mirror argument, it needs more rigor. So, for example, who holds the mirror? Where is the mirror placed? Because end of the day, everything is in the hands of the writer. If the writer does not want to speak about caste atrocities, then the writer ends up presenting the picture of a society that is caste free. If the writer does not want to speak, reflect on patriarchy, let's say a male writer, then the writer ends up presenting the picture of a society that is free of gender discrimination or that has gender disparity and so on. So one has to be very careful about this mirror argument. Very often people say literature provides a mirror to the age, but basically literature can be a direct reflection, but need not be a direct reflection. We have to be very careful. We have to figure out who's the author, when is the author writing, why is the author writing about a few things, why is the author not writing about few things, and so on and so forth. Now, I'll just give you an example, and then just to kind of see the connections between literature and sociology. So, students and other faculty members of sociology here might know very well about the works of Max Weber. Now, Max Weber happens to be one of the icons of sociology. In fact, in many ways, Max Weber brings in a complete shift in sociological analysis, methodology of sociology, and in general, the overall disposition of the subject. So Weber kind of brings a certain kind of a turn in sociological theory. So there is sociology before Weber and there is sociology after Weber. Now, Weber speaks about something very interesting. Of course, he has a range of interesting things to speak about and write about. But one of the things that he speaks about is in relation to bureaucracy. And Weber's take on bureaucracy is rather ambivalent, as we say, because on the one hand, so we really don't know whether Weber is in favor of bureaucracy or he is not in favor of bureaucracy. Because on the one hand, he speaks about bureaucracy as an ideal type, and he speaks about bureaucracy as the ultimate form of rational legal authority, and he considers this particular form of authority as better and more efficient and more rational and transparent as compared to charismatic and traditional. So that's one side of the story. So you read all of that and you realize that Weber is essentially a proponent of bureaucracy. But at the same time, Weber is also writing about the ills of bureaucracy, that what too much of bureaucracy or what bureaucratization, as many scholars write, what can it lead to? And it is in this case that Weber looks at the broader process, of which bureaucratization is a subset, the process of rationalization. And this rationalization is a very important theme in Weber's sociological theory. And rationalization is essentially a situation wherein people sort of tend to distance themselves more and more from tradition and emotion. So, the four social actions that Weber speaks about, the traditional action, emotional action, value oriented, and goal oriented, So Weber essentially says that increasingly people will move. Of course, traditional and emotional will gradually disappear, and even value oriented action will give way to goal oriented action, which is the instrumental action. Now, this will, according to Weber, create a world which is characterized by utmost rationality. And Weber says that this is going to lead to, and he uses very interesting phrases. So the phrase is iron cage of rationality, disenchantment. And he speaks about how people will become, he beautifully puts it, religiously unmusical. That's the phrase that Weber uses. Now, this is all Weber, and Weber has written beautifully about this. So anyone who's read Weber can know that Weber was somebody who kind of almost predicted what is going to happen as a result of advances in bureaucracy and capitalism. Now, someone who is very much a contemporary of Weber, but not a sociologist, a great short story writer, novelist, again, a German, basically Czech German, Franz Kafka. Now, if you read, now Kafka, of course, is not a sociologist. Kafka is considered as one of the most celebrated, one of the great authors of 20th century, and easily one of the greatest from Western Europe. Now, Kafka is also writing about rationality. Kafka is writing about bureaucracy. Kafka is writing about a certain kind of goal oriented society. Uh, Kafka is writing about a certain kind of instrumentalism, disenchantment, people going religiously musical, but through his stories. So if you read his Metamorphosis, which is considered as one of his finest pieces, if you read Trial, if you read various other stories of his, and you read his essays, reflections here and there, one of the things that you straight away get is that basically Weber and Kafka, in some senses, are reflecting on the same problems. As contemporaries, they are essentially grappling with the same problem. Kafka is reflecting on the problem through short stories and novels, and Weber is reflecting on the problem through solid sociological books and essays. Now, this, when you read these two, you realize that there is a certain deeper connection between sociology and literature. In fact, there's a great work that you can perhaps at some point consult. It's called Sociology as an Art Form. And this is a book by Robert Nisbet, an American sociologist. He's a great sociologist in the 60s and 70s. And Nisbet has written on this, Sociology as an Art Form, in which Nisbet actually draws a connection between great writers and iconic sociologists. So, for example, he draws connections between Karl Marx on capitalism and Charles Dickens on industrial Britain. So his argument is that if you read Dickens' Oliver Twist or David Copperfield or even A Tale of Two Cities, you will see that there is a certain connection between what Dickens is writing and how Marx is reflecting on capitalism in the 19th century, England, Western Europe, etc. Now, so this is just to point out. Now, very often, so just to go back to the point that I was making earlier, that many of my professors were not really in favor of me doing sociology literature study. Their concern is why is it that people don't really want us to kind of get into such uh, adventurous journeys? uh, their concern is that if we start studying literature as a sociology student, the sociological rigor will be compromised. So their argument is, or their thinking is, that sociological rigor will go down. If we study literature, then sociological rigor won't be there. So this is of course quite it's actually weird, because this is almost like people saying that don't travel the world or don't go and meet people from other cultures, because there is a possibility that you will lose out on your own culture, right? That's its typical nativism, protectionism, etc. Now, we know very well that that's never the case. In fact, the most iconic example to sort of present a counter thesis to this is one of our great, in fact, I would say the greatest in the 19th and 20th century, for as long as this person lived, Tagore. So, Tagore is somebody who traveled across the world and who very intimately uh, got to know various cultures, traditions, and people, and wrote about them. But at the heart, at the root, Tagore remained an Indian. And the phrase that is used for Tagore is rooted cosmopolitan. Ramchandra Guha uses this for Tagore in his famous book, The Collection. makers of modern India. So, rooted cosmopolitan. Basically, what it means is that you can and you must engage with other cultures, but at the same time, you should hold on to what you bring. So, if as sociology students we are engaging with literature, it does not mean that we will get carried away and we will lose out on our sociology. Of course, our sociological rigor is going to remain, and for all we know, it will only be more informed and more nuanced and more reflexive. I'll just give you two examples in terms of this sociology and literature connections, and then I'll stop because it's already, I think it's been about 30-35 minutes that I've been speaking. So I'll just take maybe another 5 to 8 minutes, and then maybe we can have questions and answers. So there are two examples that I have. One is from my own doctoral research, which is the example of the great legendary poet philosopher Muhammad Iqbal. Now, Iqbal is born in 1877, died in 1938. Now, Iqbal, of course, is a poet, is a philosopher, political thinker, but of course, more than anything else, Iqbal is a poet, and a great poet, a first-rate poet. Now, when you engage with, so one is, of course, you engage with Iqbal just as a literature person, and there's nothing wrong with that. I think hundreds of scholars have already done that. I don't think there is any other poet from India on whom people have written as much as people have written on Iqbal. So already, I think it's kind of almost at the it's just exhaustive in some senses. But how do we engage with Iqbal as a sociology student? So, for example, that would then bring us to other kinds of questions that usually literature people do not engage with. For example, uh, why did Iqbal write a certain kind of poetry when he was in Europe from 1905 to 1908? Why was he not writing in Urdu while he was in Europe? Why was he only writing in Persian or predominantly writing in Persian while he was in Europe? Why is it that there is a sudden shift in his poetic registers after he has come back from Europe? So, why is it that before he leaves for Europe, he is more of a, I would say, not really a nationalist, but a very patriotic poet? And there is a certain kind of universalism in him because he is borrowing from, he's essentially reflecting on nature's imageries and universal imageries. But then after 1908, when he comes back, there is a certain kind of Islamicized poetry that we find in Iqbal, and it's a major turn. So then these are some of the important questions that one begins to engage with. And then also, what kind of concerns did Iqbal have as a middle class individual, right? What were his vulnerabilities? What were his insecurities? What were his convictions? And so on and so forth. So basically, this is a typical sociology of literature exercise that you situate the author in the broader political, social, economic contexts, and then you try and make sense of why Iqbal was writing a particular way in a particular time period. So that is one. That is Iqbal, and that's a very dry, cut to cut exercise. But say, for example, if you have to kind of really borrow from literature, then the other example that I have is, let's say, any short story, and you can pick your case. But I would, for example, and if you haven't read this short story, you must. Krishan Chandra, an iconic progressive writer, wrote a brilliant short story in the 50s, and the title of the story is Kalu Bhangi. So, Kalu Bhangi is this extraordinary story that Krishan Chandra has written, and those of you who've read will get it. Why is it that I'm speaking so highly of the story? And those of you who haven't must read, and then perhaps you will get to know why I happen to be such a big fan of this particular short story. Now, if you read Kalu Bhangi, now Krishan Chandra again is a he's a writer, right? He's a literary person. But if you read Kalu Bhangi, basically Kalu Bhangi is about, so if you read it, it's about a character. And as you can get from the title, the character is basically a sweeper. And Krishan Chandra in the short story, this character is constantly telling the author that when are you going to write about it, right? And this is an interesting question because through this particular story, and in fact, through the opening passages, what Krishan Chandra is telling us is also about literature's problematic priorities. That literature, usually for a very long time, attended to the beautiful, the grand, the spectacular, the dazzling, the rich, the appealing, the captivating. And literature was not really reflecting on the diseased, on the miserable, on the poor, the marginalized, right? The ostracized, the untouchables, and so on. And it is only because of the progressive movement that people sort of started writing about the periphery, the ugly, the hideous, and so on. So these are some of the things. So now, when in this particular story, if you read it, when Kalubhangi is constantly, as the writer says, that Kalubhangi has been there at the door, and for ages, this character has been asking me that, Babu, when are you going to write about me, right? When are you going to write about me? I've been here for so many years, and you have not written about me. And one thing with which Krishan Chandra begins is that there is nothing to write about you, right? Because here is an untouchable, here is a sweeper, a marginalized person whose life doesn't offer anything. So the person has not fallen in love, the person does not have anything, extraordinary. It's sort of a very routine existence that the person is sweeping, the person is taking care of the animals, and the person essentially has his daily meal. Everything is just so monotonous and flat that even if Kalubhangi were to live for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, basically Kalubhangi is only living the same day again and again and again. Now, this is interesting, right? Because when you read that story, you begin to understand caste, untouchability, marginalization, and the whole idea of experience very differently. Now, I'm not saying that you don't have excellent ethnographies of caste in sociology. Of course, there are wonderful works on caste in sociology as well. There are interesting autoethnographies as well. For example, if you were to read, not so recent, but I think 2020, it came out, Caste Matters by Suraj Yengre, who's currently at Harvard, postdoctoral associate. So there are interesting works, but the moment you get into the literature part of it, you begin to appreciate these things very differently. So you can read a solid academic sociological article on caste, and of course you will learn a lot uh, after reading that or through that article. Or you could listen to a wonderful lecture by a great sociologist on caste. But when you read Krishan Chandra's Kalu Bhangi, you begin to understand caste in a very intimate way, right? It does something to you. If you're really reading it with that earnestness, right, with that sincerity, then you begin to then caste suddenly speaks to you, right? It touches you, and you begin to feel the problem of caste. It's almost like you read. So Ambedkar has written many texts, and of course extraordinary texts, and a text that's very often referred to as Annihilation of Caste. It's a great text, and I really don't think there are more important primers than or manifestos than Annihilation of Caste in the 20th century. But Ambedkar wrote another text, and unfortunately, that's a text that people don't refer to. And I request the audience here to check it out on internet. It's there. It's called Waiting for Visa, right? And Waiting for Visa is it's a brilliant autobiographical reflection. It's just few pages. It's just few pages, and you just read it. And Ambedkar is writing about his childhood as a Dalit, his growing up years, and various other instances. So it's a combination. It's a collection of 8 or 9 sort of short reflections, and when you read it, you understand caste very differently. I'm not saying that reading Annihilation of Caste doesn't do that, or reading what Gandhi and Congress have done to the untouchables doesn't do that. Of course, these are great texts, but as I said, that the moment you bring in this autobiographical, literary subjectivity in it, it touches us very differently. So these are just two quick examples to help us understand in what ways can we get literature and sociology together. Now, to conclude, so what I'm basically, I don't know whether I was coherent in the last 40 minutes or so. What I'm, what I'm essentially trying to do is making a case for bringing together literature and sociology. And the argument is that literature and sociology essentially share their interests in the sense that they are both interested in man's social world. Sociology looks at it from one vantage point, Literature looks at it from a somewhat different vantage point. But there are interesting avenues, there are interesting opportunities for sociology and literature to sort of come together and essentially invest in wonderful academic scholarly ventures. And as students, if we were to kind of take this step further in this direction, I think we'll have a wonderful time learning about new ideas and about this fusion of two disciplinary horizons. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Faruqi, for telling us so many beautiful connections between sociology and literature that we never knew about. As expected, the lecture was really highly enlightening, illuminating, and thought provoking. I must say, whatever you said is not just to understand, but also to empathize, and not only to analyze, but also to imagine. Thank you. Now, I would like to call Dr. Vanna Mishra to propose a vote of thanks for this session.
I'm audible. Thank you, Dr. Archana. Yes, so what a enlightening session given by Dr. Irfanullah Farooqui. Good afternoon, one and all present over here. Myself, Dr. Vandana Mishra, Assistant Professor, Sociology, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. I am here to give the vote of thanks on the behalf of our department, Department of Humanities and Social Sciences. First of all, I would like to extend my heartfelt gratitude to the Chancellor of Integral University, Syed Wasim Akhtar sir, for providing us with these opportunities and for his continuous encouragement and support. And next, I would like to express my gratitude to the Pro Chancellor of Integral University, Syed Nadeem Akhtar sir. As a young and dynamic leader, he continuously encourages us to organize and participate in these valuable and informative sessions. And I would like also to thank our Vice Chancellor in Riga University, Professor Javed Musarrat sir, who is always a pillar of strength for us. And I also wish to express my gratitude to Professor Zeba Akil ma'am, head of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, for her continuous guidance, support, and motivation throughout the entire process. And I would like to express my sincere thanks to our esteemed speaker, Dr. IRFANULLAH Farooqui, for sharing his valuable insight on the relationship between sociology and literature. Sir, this discussion has significantly enhanced our knowledge and understanding of the subject, and the student have greatly benefited from it. And before we conclude, let us extend our heartfelt gratitude to all faculty member of the sociology, including Dr. Archana Pandey, Dr. Zaved Akhtar, and Dr. Faizan Haq, for making this online session possible. We also thank the student and participant who joined this online lecture. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this generosity. Is is it
Thank you, sir.
over? Should we Are we
Yeah.
done for the day? Okay. Thank you very much. So then I'll leave the studio. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay,
Take
sir.
care,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you
Yeah.
so much.
Bye.
Thank you.